Let's turn our attention back to international affairs. Joining me is Sam Roggeveen, Director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program. Sam, let's start with the United States because very early stages of the Iowa caucuses, we're going to be looking at that all throughout the afternoon. But I'm just wondering from your overall view of where things are at as we start 2020, Donald Trump looks like he's going to be cleared. The impeachment hearing has been quite some drama in Washington, some theatre. But in terms of the politics of where things are at overall in the United States, how's it looking for Donald Trump and his re-election?
Well, my overall view of it, actually taking a view that's even broader than just the United States, among Western democracies generally, the mood is still very much anti-establishment. I think that's why Brexit succeeded. I think that's why populist candidates, populist parties have done so well in Western Europe. And I think that's why Donald Trump did as well as he did in 2016. So I don't see that mood has shifted perceptibly in the United States. And so at this stage, my sense is that Trump would still be a strong favourite for re-election. Among the Democrats, it seems to me that the candidate who has the most, who has the clearest anti-establishment credentials would be Bernie Sanders. The other front-runner, of course, is Joe Biden, but he's very much the insider's candidate, the Washington insider, and represents an establishment that I think so many Americans feel has let them down.
It's interesting when you look at the polling because his approval rating historically is not that high, Donald Trump that is, but his base, the Republican support for him, is huge. It's rock solid, isn't it? It's quite a divided, what it has been for a long time, but even more so probably than ever. It is a very divided nation in terms of its politics.
Well, it's yes, that is I think particularly among the political class, politics America has never been more divided. Actually, I question a little bit whether American society is necessarily that divided. I mean, on many metrics, American societies become more, I think, much more tolerant, much more liberal, just as our own society has over the last few decades. But so I'm not entirely convinced that the nation is necessarily more divided than it used to be. But politics is certainly fiercer than it's ever been because the political parties are and the political class is more divided than ever.
And you wrote a book about this recently in terms of the upheaval we've seen in politics, not just here but elsewhere. Yeah. But we've seen some more of that today, haven't we, with the Nationals? Is this the end of it?
Yeah, a small example here in Australia today with the National Party. And look, I should say I'm not a commentator necessarily on Australian domestic politics, but so I come from an international policy think tank, and what I can offer is a bit of perspective that comes from that. And my sense is that actually our domestic political commentary tends to assume that Australian politics is kind of a closed system, that we're not influenced from other countries and from outside. But I really think that's a mistake to believe that. And in fact, there are trends going on all over Western Europe, the UK, the US, Western democracies that are hitting our shores as well. And the big trend, the big one that I spoke about in the book that came out late last year, is that our major parties are in decline. And when that happens, they become a little bit, well, they become a lot less stable, and they become a lot more vulnerable to the demands of people who are on the fringes of those parties. I think we saw a small example of that today with the ructions inside the National Party. We've seen good evidence of it over the last 10 years with our leadership instability in Australia. And I would argue that the events of today demonstrate again, one of the conclusions I came to in the book is that if you think that somehow the election of the Morrison government last year helped us to turn a corner on the last 10 years of disruption and of instability, then I think you're making a mistake. I think that kind of instability and dysfunction in Australian politics is actually quite common across the Western world, and I think it's set to continue.
It's interesting you make that conclusion, and I think it's a very compelling one. There's one example I'd like to put to you, though, as one which is in a nation where there aren't majorities in terms of governing parties. They always have to govern in coalition, and yet they've had a leader that's been there for well over a decade in Angela Merkel. I'm thinking Germany. Its system helps minor parties, the way it's structured.
Yes.
And yet she's been able to govern in governing coalitions with all sorts of groups for a long, long time, hasn't she?
She certainly has. And in fact, there's a similar example right next door in the Netherlands where they've had the same Prime Minister for 10 years and he's led 3 different coalition governments, one with Christian Democrats, another with Greens. So yes, it is possible to, cobble together governments. The New Zealanders do it as well.
With a good leader.
Indeed, with a strong and charismatic leader. The interesting thing about the German example is that Angela Merkel is now, I think, entering her 14th year as Chancellor of Germany. The party that is now the major opposition party in the German parliament, the federal parliament, is the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is a populist right-wing party. It didn't even exist when Merkel first became Chancellor. So beneath the surface, major change happening in European politics.
And in terms of the other development today, I'll get your thoughts on, because it goes to your point about the diminishing presence, or at least vote share of the major parties. I'm thinking the Greens, because Adam Bandt's the new Greens leader. He's talking about a greater influence, which Di Natale did on the way out. Do you see those sorts of parties, like the Nationals as well, pushing for more influence? Is that something that we should get used to as well?
Look, it is fascinating to me that over the last sort of 20 years, as both of our major parties have declined in Australia and their vote share gradually goes down, the primary vote share, that the Greens party hasn't made more gains in the parliament. I don't know, I don't observe it closely enough to really understand why that is. I think its vote share has increased, but probably the voting system hampers the Greens in some way. In comparison, you've had Greens parties doing very well in Germany. The German example again, in state politics in Germany, it's extremely powerful and also increasingly federally. So. But the other trend we see in Australia is that centrist politicians, but who are nevertheless independent, are doing much better. So, Tony Abbott, of course, voted out of his seat by a centrist independent. The Turnbull by-election last year, the same phenomenon happened. That's something I think we're going to see a lot more of. It's not necessarily that Australia is becoming sort of radicalised ideologically. People are just sick of the parties, that's all.
Yep, okay. Well, Sam Roggeveen, great to get your insights.
Yeah.
We'll see you soon, and